Thank goodness, my kids all off on Tuesday, right? Is it Tuesday? Can you tell I just came back from vacation, so I'm just getting used to the days of the week again. But I have no disclosures for today's presentation, and I'm really excited to talk about something that I feel, and hopefully you do as well, is so important. You know, sleep is important, not just for our physical health, but also for our mental health. And so what we're going to talk about today is recommendations for sleep, common sleep problems, and how to help our parents and families get their child to sleep and have a good night. It all comes down to knowing how much sleep a child or a teen needs, recognizing some of the common sleep problems, and most importantly, healthy sleep habits. We're going to talk a little bit about proposing a schedule, sleep schedule, and resources. I want to mention that a lot of the sleep problems that I am going to talk about can be, outside of maybe some medical problems, which I'll go through, but can be resolved by a really good, healthy sleep habit. Next slide, please. So I found this from an Irish proverb, and it says, "A good laugh and a long sleep are the best cures," in a doctor's book. I think all of us who are pediatric healthcare providers in one way or another can agree that both of these things certainly make us feel good physically and mentally. Next slide. I want to start by giving you a few things, a few sentences, so to speak, that I like to use with my parents and with families and with kids, especially teens. And the reason why I mention it is because a lot of times, we kind of take sleep for granted, right? I always say we take sleep for granted. We take hydration, drinking enough water for granted. And we really don't realize sometimes the impact that not getting a good night's sleep day after day has on the next day, the following day. And so what I tell my families is, look, again, it's so important for your mental and physical health. I mentioned that already. I tell kids all the time, it helps our brains learn new things, pay attention, and remember things. Many times I have kids who may have the diagnosis of ADHD, for example, and parents are like, well, what are some things that we can do to help them without medication? And we know that there are certain interventions that can be done at school and at home, but don't forget that sleep and creating good sleep habits is actually one as well. And the other thing I like to tell kids and families is sleep is like a vacation for your body. It helps us relax. It helps us recharge for the next day. So I like to this slide because I wanted you to have some language around helping motivate them and understand the importance of sleep. Next slide. Because I think we both can agree that this is something that's important. And so from healthychildren.org, this is a slide that explains how much sleep does a child need. And as you can see, it starts with 4 months. 4 to 12 months is about 12 to 16 hours, and that includes naps. I get a lot of family questions, especially in those infant and toddler areas, even preschool. How much sleep do they actually need? And so these are some good guidelines: 11 to 14 hours of toddlers, including naps, and 10 to 13 in that preschool age, that 3 to 5 year range. Then it goes down to about 9 to 12 hours in that grade school elementary age, 6 to 12. And then by the time they're teens, we know 13 and up, it goes down 8 to 10 hours. Next slide. So it's easy to get off track, right, with our sleep routines. And it's so common, especially in school age children. There's so many demands. They have activities. I know you guys have probably spoken to families where by the time they are done with school and then have practice and try to get a meal in, and then they've got homework and we want a good bedtime routine, that it can be very difficult to try to have a set time. And what happens is that bedtime gets pushed back later and later and later. And we'll talk a little bit about teens who have a completely different biological clock, but we know that these schedules, these schoolwork, these activities, we know electronics, all play a role in making it more and more difficult for our families to establish good sleep habits and get a bedtime routine. And I think just understanding that and empathizing with them is so important, because we could tell them, look, this is what you need to do. This is how much sleep they need, blah, 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 blah. But if we don't really understand families' story, if we don't understand what their barriers are, their perspectives, these are all really important in creating a plan that's going to work for each family and for each child. Next slide. So common sleep problems are bedtime refusal, difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep. Sometimes when I talk to kids, I'll say, do you have a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep? And sometimes they say one or the other, or both, or not at all. And there's certain cases, I'm sure you've all heard, where a caregiver has to be present in order to fall asleep. There's nightmares and nighttime fears. Remember, nightmares sometimes are usually occur during REM sleep. There's different stages of sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement. And so nightmares and tend to occur, or dreams in general, they don't always have to be nightmares, right? You tend to occur later in the sleep cycle. And often kids will remember what they were dreaming about. There's also something called parasomnias, and I'm going to mention a little bit about each of these topics, because each of these could probably have a lecture in and of themselves. But I just want to mention, like, night terrors, for example, are caused by that overall arousal of the central nervous system during sleep. So what can sometimes happen is they could wake up, they will be screaming, thrashing. It's very disturbing to families. The good news is it doesn't typically signify any sort of concerning medical issue. However, like, I try to, again, empathize with them and really understand their emotions around the fact that this is so disturbing. Typically, the kids are not woken up. They're not really alert or able to talk. And it's very difficult to wake them up in these situations. So as I mentioned, there are different stages of sleep. This stage, usually sleep terrors occur during the non-REM stages, and typically within the first 2 to 3 hours. And sometimes a child could be upset and frightened and even have like a fear reaction after the night terror, but they will not remember what happened. So they might remember a dream. They're not going to remember this. And usually the age that we see this happen is between 4 and 12, but it can occur as young as 18 months and tends to be more common in boys. But like I said, it can be very upsetting. And we're going to talk about creating that routine and how we can help them. But some things that can cause it can be, things that cause nervous system stress, not getting enough rest, being overtired, etc., can all contribute to that. Sleepwalking is also very common. They usually outgrow it by the teen years. Again, first hours of sleep. It could be anything from just sitting up in sleep to wandering about to even doing inappropriate behavior. And believe it or not, sleep walking as well as sleep talking can run in the family. So you might ask if a parent has done that. And again, irregular schedules, lack of sleep, even sometimes medications or an illness can lead to sleepwalking. And sleepwalking itself is not harmful. However, the goal is to keep them safe. So you want to talk about things that can keep them safe, not falling down the stairs, not going outside, not falling from like clutter in their bedroom, for example. Just really get an idea of what their sleep environment is like so that you can help them be safe. One thing that I did while I was preparing for this is I read that a full bladder, sometimes if you are more likely to sleepwalk, can contribute. So having your families not, or having the kids not drink too much before they go to bed could also be helpful. And then there's the sleep talking. Well, there's little known about it. We usually see it in toddlers, but can go all the way up to the early teenage years. They typically will resolve by the time they go through puberty. And you really don't have to do anything. We don't recommend waking them up if they're talking. The big concerns is looking for other medical problems like sleep apnea, which we'll talk a little bit about later, and just making sure that there's no other potential root cause. But in general, you don't have to worry about it unless there's signs of sleep apnea or fever or illness, for example. And then they'd want to definitely talk to their healthcare provider. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that sleep is very important for our physical and mental health. What we find is that lack of sleep can certainly cause daytime sleepiness. That makes sense. Fatigue. And it's so funny too, because a lot of times when I'm talking to families, especially teens or even the grade school kids, where they say, my child is so tired, and they'll say, well, they're getting, 8 hours of sleep or whichever, but you really want to navigate and understand what's their sleep environment and what is their sleep quality like. When we don't sleep, everybody, including parents and families, we become irritable and moody. Hyperactivity and inattention, like I said, sometimes it can be which came first, the chicken or the egg. A lot of times ADHD can be diagnosed when really what the problem is lack of sleep or poor sleep. On the other hand, we also know that lack of sleep can also exacerbate hyperactivity and inattention if you already are diagnosed with something like that. And it's also something that we can use to intervene. It increases tantrums and disruptive behavior in toddlers. We see academic functions declining, increased anxiety, and very difficult time managing stress. I think we all can think about some times where we didn't get good sleep and the next day was rough, right? Next slide, please. So during the teen years, I want to mention that their body's internal clock is reset to fall asleep later and wake up later, okay? And this change happens because the teen's brain produces that sleep hormone melatonin. We've heard of this before. It's produced later at night than like kids and adults, for example. So teens do have a harder time falling asleep. And because of this delayed sleep-wake cycle, it can become very severe and it affects their whole daily activity, right? And in most cases, it's called delayed sleep phase syndrome or night owl syndrome, you may have heard in the past. But I mention it because it's not uncommon. I'm sure you all know a teen or several teens that fall into that habit of staying up very late and sleeping in the next morning. There's something called a sleep pressure to feel tired and to be ready to sleep. So let me explain what exactly that means. So remember this, sleep pressure. This is such great advice for your families. Most of us need to be awake once we wake up, need to be awake for about 16 hours before we're ready to fall asleep again. So let's use an example that's on the slide. If a teen isn't getting up until 1, add 1 p.m. in the afternoon, right? They won't be ready to fall asleep or feel tired until 5 a.m. So that sleep pressure explains it. So you can explain to families, this happens because that melatonin is produced later in their brains during these teen area times. And you can also explain that by waking up late, they're not going to feel tired or ready to go back to sleep for 16 hours. Now, I'm going to mention naps later. They might nap, which can certainly mess things up again too. So what we want to do is help them slowly start to wake up about 30 minutes earlier and go to bed about 30 minutes earlier. So 30 minutes, go to bed earlier, 30 minutes, wake up 30 minutes, and just very slowly kind of change that sleep pressure time. Be mindful of weekends and vacations. We all know, and it's summer now, right? So they're probably way off. But even during the school year, they'll wake up and try to keep on a schedule. And then come the weekend, they have to start over every Monday, which is very difficult. So creating a sleep plan is so important and help our families through this, and we have to be willing to make some compromises to help them with this too. Next slide. I love this. It's like a time machine. You go into it tonight and you wake up and it's tomorrow. Next slide. So how do we help them get back on track? So keep in mind, like I mentioned, you do not have to change everything all at once. We want to set them up for success, right? So we want to compromise and come up with a plan that works for everybody. So you pick maybe two. I know the slide says 2 or 3 changes. I mean, maybe your family, you just need to do 1 to 2, and give it time to work, because it's not, no pun intended, it's not going to change overnight, right? And so we need to give them a couple weeks to kind of get those first couple routines done first, and then you can build from there. And it's important to do what works for their child, works for you and works for their child. So knowing what their perspective is, knowing what their goals are, knowing what their barriers are, there's certain things we just can't control. Maybe it's a parent's schedule, for example, their own work schedule. And so we need to kind of understand their story and their lifestyle so that we can fit it in for them. And remember, even in the same family, sleep habits can look different for different children, and perfection is not the goal. I always say we want it to get better. It doesn't have to be perfect. We just want better. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? Well, if the most important thing is to stick to a schedule, including waking up and going to bed around the same time every day. And yes, I tell my families, even on the weekends, there's going to be some flexibility, of course, but if we're trying to create this healthy sleep habit, this is something that would be a goal. We want to create a consistent sleep routine, and what I mean by that too is just consistency is really what's going to make things better. Limit time spent in bed. I've started talking to my kids and recommending that their bed should only be used for sleep. Okay. So ideally, kids should only be in bed when they're sleeping and not while they're watching TV or scrolling on their phones or doing schoolwork or eating. And this helps create a strong connection between sleep and their bed. So biologically, they will eventually understand, when I'm in bed, this is what I do in this bed as I sleep. So this is probably one of the most common problems, especially as the, older grade school and teens. So this is one of the changes that I try to encourage right off the bat. Avoid naps. So if in a perfect world, again, there would be no naps starting in the early elementary age groups, right? When we look back at that slide that says how much sleep they need, right? But we know that sometimes it happens. So I tell them, okay, well, if you're going to nap, let's set a timer and try to wake up after just 20 to 30 minutes so that it doesn't mess up your sleep the time when you're ready to fall asleep, and also that sleep pressure time that I mentioned. It's also really important to avoid electronics. We're going to talk a little bit about some advice that we can give to our families, and get outside and be active. Even if it's just 5 minutes, spend some time outside. Tell them, go for a walk, play basketball, throw a football, jump rope, play tag, dance. Anything that gets your heartbeat going will help. And we also know that seeing sunlight during the day, especially in the morning, helps create that better internal body clock, that sleep and day rhythm. So waking up in the morning and getting some sunlight in those early hours, again, even if it's just for a short amount of time, reduces the production of melatonin, and it allows them to be more awake and active and alert during the day. Avoid large meals or caffeine before bed. I think we've all heard that. And be a good role model. This is just as difficult for parents and families too. And it's so important. I always say it's a trickle down effect. As caregivers for children, we need to take care of ourselves so that we are better for our kids. And so this means that caregivers should also follow the advice as well, right? And say things out loud. Like I'm gonna give you an example. Like, I'd really like to watch my show right now, but I know it's too close to bedtime and I want to make sure I get a good night's sleep as well. So it is very important for our families to be good role models. Next slide, please. So avoiding the screens. This is a different age group, a different time in all of our cultures right now. And these are suggestions. Again, we want to give this advice, but at the same time, again, talking to the families, figuring out what kind of compromises, a plan that works for them, a plan that works for each child. But these are some suggestions and takeaways. So it is highly recommended to stop using electronics, any type of electronics, at least 30 minutes before bed. Ideally, 60 minutes would be great, but for some, I don't think that's realistic, right? And so I would say 30 minutes, because remind them that they need that sleep hormone, that melatonin that we all produce naturally. It does not, our bodies do not start producing it until it gets dark. And so if we're looking at a screen, if we're looking at a tablet, if we're watching television, that light is going to suppress the production of melatonin and make it harder to go to sleep. So we need that 30-minute time period where we don't have those electronics. And then once you go to bed, right, we want to make sure that they're avoid using their devices, once it's bedtime, once they're in bed. Remember, bed is for sleep. Really try to set that habit as much as you can. So what are some ways you could set some do not disturb? You can have the kids leave it in another part of the house. You could charge it across the room, for example. I like that idea too, especially if some kids use it as their alarm clock because they have to get out of bed to turn it off. And it also makes it so that they don't roll over in the middle of the night and check, did so-and-so text me, or, who sent a Snapchat, blah, blah, blah. Because guess what? That light is going to deceive the body and think that it's time to wake up. And so they may have a difficulty falling back to sleep. We all wake up in the middle of the night. We know this, but what we have to be able to do is fall back to sleep. They can turn their electronics into parents at nighttime and charge them outside the bedroom. And I do want to encourage families to remove TVs or video game systems, or take power cords or even controllers out at bedtime if you can't necessarily, if they still have like the video games in there, maybe you set something up so that they don't have that, urge, or that, they want to do it. It's there. But this is not going to come without a struggle. I think we all know. So small steps, again, what works for each family. Next slide, please. So what does a sleep routine look like? So maybe they would take a shower, brush their teeth, use the bathroom, change into their sleep clothes, read a book, listen to calm music or relaxing meditation. So the light and so on is important to not have the light. But some people need some kind of sound. So it's okay to have a sound as long as it's not, super stimulating, right? Because some people just can't fall asleep when it's, also really quiet. Meditations are great. But you just have to find the one that works for you. There's Calm, there's all kinds of different apps. Some people sleep to rain. I particularly I have a fan. So having like even a sound machine or a fan or something, and those things can work all the way from infancy all the way up through teens. There's a really cool program through the American Academy of Pediatrics called Brush Book Bed. It's easy to remember. Each night, help your child brush your teeth, read a favorite book or two, and get to bed at a regular time each night. So it's cool, and you can look that up, and they've got some additional resources for you too. Next slide, please. So that's the routine. Now we want to make sure that we set up a sleep hygiene. I want to back up to routine for just a second. It brings me back to, I have two sons, and my sons are now older, and they're out of the house now. But I remember that our routine was, they would take a shower and brush their teeth, they put their pajamas on. And even though they slept in separate bedrooms, we would all lay down in Gabe's room and we would read books together at night. So I had two boys, and at the time I had two yellow labs. And so it was really fun because even the labs would come and get into bed with us, and we would read. And then it was time to say goodnight, and they would go into their separate rooms. The dogs would come downstairs with me. And it was just it not only helped them create good sleep habits, but it was such an important family time for us. So let them know that this is really good connection with your kids as well. So now we've got the sleep routine, or, we want to get a bedtime routine, right? Sleep hygiene talks about what is our sleep environment like. It needs to be quiet. So yes, you can have the background noise, but we don't want it to be like super loud or stimulating. And it absolutely needs to be dark. Whenever I've consulted sleep experts, one of the things that they recommend are those blackout curtains. Obviously, not everybody can do that. We've definitely, in certain situations, especially if we're on vacation, have, put a towel or an extra sheet up to make it a little bit dark, but it does need to be dark. Now, I realize that some kids are a little bit scared. So you could have like a little night light or something, but for the most part, you want the room to be dark, relaxing, and comfortable temperature too. If it's too hot, it's going to be very difficult. So even being a little bit cooler tends to help people sleep. I mean, obviously we don't want to be freezing, but you get the idea. Next slide, please. So it's important that you ask about sleep hygiene and what their sleep environment is like, especially if they say they're getting, so many hours of sleep, maybe they're not really getting a good night's sleep. And what this study that I'm presenting to you today was showing that in the 10 years between 2009 and 2019, that the trends for shorter sleep duration, especially among the US high school students, was pretty dramatic. And so this came from the CDC's National Youth Behavior Survey, and it was based on the response to the question, on average school night, how many hours do you get? Pretty simple, right? And so what they found is that sleep duration over those 10 years just decreased, that the shortened sleep duration increased. So basically they got less and less and less sleep over those 10 hours period. And then, and it was higher among female versus male students across the years, which is, I didn't know that until I was reading about this study. Next slide, please. So what this shows is, in addition, another study that looked at percentage of high school students who got 8 or more hours. And not only did they look at it just based on sex, but they looked at the grade and race and ethnicity. And this was done in 2021. And if you look, and I know it's kind of hard to see it, it's pretty dramatic, where you see then again from 9th grade to like 11th/12th grade, that sleep, duration, the percentage of kids who actually got 8 hours of sleep. But even in 9th grade, it was only 25%, which is pretty alarming if you think about it. And then when you look, there's a difference between Black, Hispanic, Latino, and white, and also male, female. In this particular study, you can see that the males, just like I mentioned in the other study, there was a greater percentage of kids of males that overall had, greater percentage that had 8 hours versus the female. And if you'd like more information about the studies, I have included the the link as well. Next slide, please. So what are some things, that we want? I mentioned, it could be that they don't have a sleep routine. It could be that they're going to bed late. It could be that we just need to fix their sleep hygiene, for example. All the things, right? And those are all the most common things: habits, hygiene, etc. But we do know that some kids do suffer from these different sleep disorders. So let me mention just a few key things about each one. We know that insomnia is basically, by definition, the is either trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. And this could be from that poor sleep environment or poor sleep habits, but it also could be from illness, if they're congested or coughing. So I always ask, even when I see kids on an acute basis, how is their sleep affected by this? Okay. Because we also know that, we mentioned sleep mentally and physically, but we know it helps us heal, right? Stress and anxiety could be playing a role in the insomnia, or other mental health problems like depression. And then there's certain medications that may be altering that and causing a delayed sleep phase. And so really getting the idea of what medications are you on, or has there been any changes or increase in dosages, for example. And then there are certain medical diagnoses that and chronic medical problems that can sometimes set them up for a greater likelihood of insomnia. Narcolepsy, although very rare, can happen during childhood and teens. And what happens is they're either very sleepy during the day, they can feel drowsy or even fall asleep. And they kind of just lose control of their muscles, and it can be, dangerous, especially if a person has one of these sleep attacks while they're driving, for example. And so, they tend to have trouble falling asleep at night then, and they wake up a lot. So, we want to talk about what is their daytime sleepiness like? And then you may or may not have heard of restless leg syndrome or periodic limb movement disorders. This can happen with certain teens where their legs or arms twitch at night, and they have this urge to move their legs. And this usually happens at night. Their legs could feel tingly or itchy or crampy or even burn. And these kids also have trouble falling asleep through at night. And during the day, they, of course, feel cranky. They feel tired. Again, the attention and behavior. And sometimes kids might have a combination of these different things. Now, one of the most important things, though, is to really make sure you take a good history about sleep apnea. And again, this could be a whole nother lecture, but just to give you an idea, the most common is, what sleep apnea is when they stop breathing. And usually kids suffer from what we call obstructive sleep apnea, or where something obstructs or blocks the upper airway. And it interrupts sleep again, and it can make the oxygen's body level go down, oxygen levels go down, and carbon dioxide go up, and they miss out on a restful sleep. So if it goes untreated, it can certainly lead to medical as well as mental problems with behavior, with growth, with their heart, for example, and their learning. And so you might ask about snoring, or how do they breathe at night? Are they restless? Do they sleep in unusual positions? Bedwetting, especially if they've previously been dry and now all of a sudden they're having accidents. What's their daytime sleepiness? What's their behavior? Learning? Do they have any sleep terrors or sleepwalking? And it's hard for these kids to obviously get a good night's sleep. They have a hard time waking up. And in this case, this is something that we definitely want to investigate more, and may need to do a sleep study or polysomnograph. Next slide, please. So sleep and chronic disease, we do know that chronic diseases can go hand in hand, and sleep health in how we manage those chronic diseases are so important, because insufficient sleep can be linked to developmental and linked to difficulties in management of many of these chronic diseases. For example, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and depression. I know this is our PMP program, and we know too that studies have shown that kids that do not get good sleep at night, whether it's good quality sleep or a good amount of sleep, tend to be more likely to be obese. And so it is very important, even with our chronic illnesses with kids that we're trying to manage. We know that there is a link. So for everyone, we all need a good night's sleep, right? Next slide, please. Go ahead, next slide. And this slide, I think we can all relate to too. It's like, I want to sleep, but my brain just won't stop talking to itself. And this is very common amongst kids. Sometimes they don't know, you might say, well, what's going on that you have trouble falling asleep? And so it's important that we ask. Next slide. So according to a study in a recent medical journal, we know there's that link between mental health and sleep, right? But it's bi-directional. And like I mentioned, that kind of which came first, the chicken or the egg. So teens with anxiety struggle with getting enough sleep, and teens that don't get enough sleep are more likely to develop anxiety. And one of the most common is what we call sleep anxiety. Next slide. In other words, what I mean by that is, I for example, I had a patient who, she was so anxious, she had some anxiety and some stress. So it was hard for her to fall asleep. Well, then it got to the point where she just became anxious to go to bed because she knew the pattern and what was going to happen. And so she developed that sleep anxiety. And this became just kept compounding itself. So it was like, now she just was anxious about just going to bed, period. What happens is anxiety and that chronic stress releases the stress hormone cortisol. And when cortisol is too high, it's very difficult to sleep. Sleep deprivation can also cause cortisol. They could feel super shaky or fidgety or have that, mood changes. Maybe their breathing or their heart rate, or even like they sweat at night. They might clench fists or get headaches or, get that tight jaw. It affects appetite. We know kids that before bed, they have stomach aches, or maybe first thing in the morning, they have stomach aches, nausea, can't eat. So it becomes almost this like conundrum, because the anxiety can increase cortisol, which causes decreased sleep, and then decreased sleep increases cortisol, and elevated cortisol causes all those other symptoms, which just make it so hard for these kids. Next slide, please. But I do believe that awareness is the majority of it. So talking about it, trying to figure out what is the underlying cause of their anxiety, of their stress, of their sleep problems, and then going back to that routine, to that structure, are they getting all the things that I just mentioned in the beginning? Are they getting enough hours? What is their schedule like? What barriers do they have? What's their sleep environment? What routine do they have? And encouraging those healthy habits to address that lack of sleep so that we can reduce the anxiety. But I also know it's not that simple. I want to make some suggestions that I do with my families. For example, with the younger kids, I have what I suggested, a worry box. And so they could take a shoe box and decorate it or do whatever they want. And then during their bedtime routine, they could sit and kind of talk about anything that's going through their brain and write it down on a piece of paper and put it in the worry box. So it's in the worry box and out of our head. We could do the same thing with teens. I know it's a novelty these days to take out a piece of paper and a pen, right? But journaling, it is documented that journaling will help calm that brain, help reduce that cortisol, and just writing it down. I tell them, look, you don't have to ever read it again. You don't have to show it to anybody. You don't have to, you could throw it away, you could keep it, whatever. But I coin this, this phrase, I didn't make it up, so I can't take credit for it, but brain dump. Get all those things that are going through your head out on paper and help them just dump it out of their head so that then they can have a fan or listen to some music or meditation and really focus on getting a better night's sleep. But it takes time, and we need to teach them that it's going to take time. Next slide, please. So, there's so much to talk about with sleep, and the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, as well as, oh, that's my coffee machine, sorry, as well as the American Academy of Pediatrics. And as I mentioned, healthychildren.org has a lot of resources that can be for parents. They have resources for kids that you can give them. Of course, we are creating some wonderful new resources to help with sleep. I'm so excited. As Alex said, we've extended that PMP program to also include not just school age, but now teenagers. And I hope that this information, whether there's a couple pearls from today, such as changing things 1, 2, or 3 things at a time and giving it time to help, using the bed just for sleep and avoiding doing anything else in our beds so that our bodies, and then understanding that sleep pressure and explaining it to families so that they understand and kids understand, look, you're not going to feel tired until 2 a.m. if you wake up at this time, and then helping them slowly create a better bedtime and wake time that's consistent so that they can get a good night's sleep and ultimately live better physically and mentally. Thank you so, so much. I know we have, plenty of time for questions. So I do want to thank Alex for all her hard work as our program manager for PMP, as well as the Ohio Department of Health, who has given us so much support, not only for this particular webinar, but for our entire program in general. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adams.
Yeah.
Are there any questions now that can be put into the chat box? There was a recommendation from Carolyn, and that said that her recommendation for night lights, if fears are concerned in the dark, is to switch out a white bulb for red. You have much better night visibility with red light without making it too light in the room. And then,
what a great idea. I like that idea a lot.
Yeah. I'd never heard that before. That's great.
Yeah.
And then Dr. Brew asked, what are your thoughts on melatonin supplements?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think that, melatonin, and you could probably line up 10 pediatricians and they might all give you a different answer, right? Because, there's some controversy about it. In my practice in general, the way that I approach it is really trying to first, identify what could be the root causes, for their sleep problems, and really focusing on that before any kind of supplementation. I do tell families, though, that, melatonin, our body produces its own melatonin. And so really encouraging that bedtime routine, that sleep hygiene, especially the darkness, for example, is one of the best ways for our own body to produce the melatonin. If the family chooses, or, especially if, you're taking a history and you find out that they are using it, I usually don't recommend it. What I tend to find is a lot of families are already using it. So I try to, again, get their perspective and their goals. And I also remind them, less is more. So lowest dose possible. And also making sure if it works more effectively if you don't give it every night. Now, that that could very well, I'm sure there's going to be families who there's kids who just need it every night. Hopefully it can just be a low dose and that they're trying to do all the other things too to help. But lowest dose, try to use it only as needed, and just make sure that, we've exhausted all other, you know, habits, as well as all other possibilities as a root cause for their sleep disturbance.
Great,
So thanks.
thank
That's a
you.
great question.
I was going to ask that too. So great.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments that anyone would like to chat about before we wrap up?
This is a hard subject, you guys. It's like, we know it's so important. It's right up there, like I said, with hydration and nutrition, but it's hard. It's really hard. So I think meeting families where they're at is really important, because we want to set them up for success. And so I think understanding that and really working with them is probably one of the most important goals that you both should have. So
Great. And just a few reminders. Please be on the lookout for the post-survey evaluation to receive your certificate. You will need to have completed your pre-survey evaluation that I sent out via email prior to the training in order to receive your certificate after completing your post-survey. Please provide any feedback during those evaluations. It's really important for us to have that information to improve our trainings. Please register for our PMP toolkit via the SurveyMonkey link that I put into the chat box. And please also, right now, if you have time, take time to download the PMP mobile app. You can search Parenting at Meal and Playtime in the App Store or on Google Play. And we really appreciate you all joining our trainings. We really thank the Ohio Department of Health for their support and collaboration with the Parenting at Mealtime and Playtime program. Please go to our website to check out the resources and training materials. And we hope to see you during our next training. Thank you to Dr. Adams for sharing this great information and always being willing to lead our trainings. And if there are any questions that come up later, please feel free to send me an email at amiller@ohioaap.org. And I look forward to hearing from you soon.
thanks,
Thank you so
everybody.
much. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah.